Okay, regardless of your feelings on this series as a whole, can I just say the actor who played Lord Hood literally looks like the character from the game. Like, pitch perfect game to, like, real life casting there. Regardless of that, though, hello everybody, I'm here to give you my thoughts on the second episode of the Halo video game TV adaptation over on Paramount+, this time episode 2, Unbound. Staying kind of general before I get into like the nitty-gritty specifics in a minute, I like this episode a hell of a lot more than I liked episode 1, because I'm starting to now, with this episode, get over a little bit of my expectations as a fan of the game. I still look at like Pablo Schreiber's Master Chief, and I still don't see like the Master Chief that I know from the video games, and it's still throwing me a little bit, but I'm less like hung up on that than I was in the first episode. And I'm kind of like more willing to roll with the punches of like taking this story on its own terms instead of comparing it to the games. There's a couple moments here and there, specifically more with like visuals, like we get to see the Covenant's High Charity ship in this episode, and I looked at it and I liked the design, but I was just like, oh, I loved the like big open area with like all the Covenants all around inside of that ship that we got to see within Halo 2. And so I'm still kind of thrown a little bit in the comparison, but given more and more time to just acclimatize to what this show is versus the game, I'm getting a little bit more into it. I'm still a little thrown as like who this show is for in terms of like getting fans of the game into the show, because it still feels like it's throwing me as a fan too much, but I also don't know like if people who aren't big Halo fans are going to get into this show, so I'm still kind of off there, but I'm getting into it a little bit more. But actually sort of taking this show on its own terms, as I said, I did really start to enjoy this one a lot more because I'm starting to see the themes and ideas that the show is trying to wrestle with, namely around these concepts of control versus free will, as well as themes of what it means to be human, and sort of bringing that all together in the character of John. And I'm actually really liking that those are ideas that this show is beginning to explore, because they're central to ideas of like agency in video games, as well as like themes of religion and things like that the Halo game sort of talked about, with how religion was often used as an institution of control with the Covenant, as well as the military also being used as an institution of control. And the show's getting at it in a different way than the game does necessarily, just because it's sort of being more critical of the UNSC and military apparatus than the actual games are. But I do think it is still in line with the themes of the game, and I'm very much appreciating that. And then on top of that, I actually really am appreciating some of the world building that the show is doing separate from the games. The game's very much focused on like military Covenant, we're going to deal with that, and then we'll also deal with like the big Forerunner Halo technology, and so the big mythos of the huge history behind the Halo universe. Whereas this one's much more focusing on the human side of things. I think partially that's mostly because of just budgetary reasons. You don't have to pay less money if you don't have to always constantly do the Covenant CGI stuff. But I also am liking like, oh, it's actually really dealing with these themes within the world of humans before we possibly, hopefully, extrapolate it out into like the galaxy-wide things like the Covenant and the Forerunners and the Halo ring and all of that stuff. Well, also still starting to see that stuff. So I'm appreciating all of that. The thing that's still throwing me is I'm wondering how this is going to be in service of the actual story, because while I like the themes, while I like the acting and elements of world building, the story still feels like it's rushing too much and not giving me enough, because I still feel like this episode feels like it should have been the third episode and not the second episode, because I feel like a lot of the things that they're trying to have me grapple with the character of John, namely like him sort of deprogramming all the learning he's learned as someone who's been like programmed just to kill, was never really set up. Like I never got to see him being that killing machine and really see him sort of being that programmed to kill machine, other than like one fighting awesome sequence in the beginning of the first episode. And so to see it starting to be deconstructed, it doesn't really ring as strong, because I never really got it set up before we started doing the deconstruction. I feel like the show is wanting me to like layer on my thoughts from the game's version of the character and bring that into it, but because this is such a separate, different character, I still don't really feel that fully. And so I'm wrestling with some of the ways that I'm really loving the world building going on here, but not necessarily, and I don't necessarily hate the characterization that's going on here. I just feel like it's moving too fast for me to really feel like I'm investing in this world and characters, and I think the way that the show expects me to already be invested. That all being said, though, let me talk about some of the specifics in here. I really loved the opening flashback sequence where we got to see John as a kid. We're starting to get a little bit of the hints of like his history as with Halsey, and I liked this connection with this Soren character who was his friend, and John being unable to deprogram himself enough to let Soren even have more than 5 minutes to escape. But like you still see elements of his humanity because he's willing to let his friend go, but he's only willing to go so far. And so I like that sort of middle ground. It shows that John has humanity in him, but he's still fully kind of in that programming thing. I wish we had seen more of that in the first episode with his character as an adult, but I like these flashbacks sort of showing us that in retrospect. And then actually bringing that into the present day where we get to see him go and seek out Soren with Quan and they meet at this cool like place called the Rubble, which is like kind of like nowhere from Guardians of the Galaxy. People are free and everything. And I like seeing people's expectations of Master Chief, like they're scared of him and he just sort of like pushes that thing out of the way. I like the weight that they're giving Spartans within this world. And then his relationship with Soren. Also, again, I really liked their back and forths. Pablo Schreiber and I don't remember the actor who plays Soren, but they had a good, they gave a good feeling of history to their characters, that they did have this sort of like feelings and affection for each other, but a bit of frustration as well, and sort of wrestling with that. Again, it wasn't like the deepest I've seen this, but for what was layered in, I think they both approached it pretty well. There also is some other weird stuff here where we do get to meet Soren's family, and Soren's wife mentions at one point that like her family was killed by the Covenant, so she sort of relates to Quan in that way. And Quan doesn't get a ton to do this episode, to be quite frank, so I'm not going to talk too much about her. But I will mention that scene in the sense that like it gives the sense that the Covenant battle with humans has been going on for a long time. But in the very first episode of the show, they had set up that the Covenant was something surprising to the sort of resistance movement against the UNSC. Like they had never seen the Covenant before, and they were like, oh my god, these are actual aliens here. And so I'm sort of like, how long is this? Your world building's a little bit strange in that sense. Like I don't know how much the Covenant are known and how long this battle's been going on. So it feels a little bit like an inconsistency. Maybe they'll work it out later on, but it felt a little bit inconsistent. And then we go from there into Soren taking us to see Wraith, who's played by the actor Podden Fane, played Podden Fane over in the Wheel of Time show, so it was cool to see him. And he's playing the stereotypical, like, I'm crazy, but I can see stuff, sort of thing, and bringing into question Master Chief, like, is he really human? Like, what is he actually? And taking the Covenant artifact, or sorry, the Forerunner artifact, actually, I'm assuming, and placing it in his hand, and it activates, and sort of questioning, like, what is actually Master Chief, and what is John within this world? Does he have more to him than meets the eye? And I like when there's the reference to the Halo rings, which we don't see yet, but when that gets referenced, there's, like, the original Halo theme plays in the background, so I like that little bring-in, send a little bit of shivers down my spine. I also like the fact that we learn that the Spartans, from Halsey, and sort of jumping over to her storyline, that the Spartans have had their emotions intentionally muted. Again, going to these ideas of themes of control, like Halsey sort of destroying their humanity by removing their emotions in order to make them killing machines and making them very much just programming. Again, going back to this idea of free will control and what it means to be human. Again, great ideas to explore. And I also really like how they're developing Cortana, as sort of building up Cortana here, because Halsey presents the idea of Cortana as an AI that's not just there to augment the Spartans as we see in the games, but she's there to overwrite their personality. And given that Cortana is like a clone of Halsey, she's literally imprinting herself upon the Spartans. Again, complete and utter control of their entire bodies and personality. Again, going into those themes that I think are really, really cool. And I like this difference in Cortana, that she's literally like an AI that is meant to control their minds, not just sort of like be an AI assistant. Again, getting at the themes, and I think a really cool change from the actual lore of the Halo games into something new. I also really like the politics that we're starting to see at play within the UNSC. We have Captain Keyes sort of being the like standard military commander, then we have Lieutenant Hood, or Lord Hood, I should say, the guy in charge. Again, the actor looks just like Lord Hood from the games. It kind of threw me for a bit, like how closely he looked like it. And I liked Halsey sort of like willing to take her chance to sort of get her ideas out there, despite the fact that the other admiral who she was working with in episode 1 clearly does not want that, and is clearly disliking that she's had someone go over her head in order to get what Halsey wants here, but willing to play again in the politics. So again, I'm liking the way that this politics and world building is being built up throughout this world. And then a couple other things to note here. Again, Quan didn't get much to do, but we do get to see a little bit of Silver Team, the sort of Master Chief's like Spartan team. I wish they'd ultimately been able to do a little bit more. They sort of like go out and then just receive Master Chief's signal and come back in. And I would have liked to see like maybe the stuff that we maybe missed with John's characterization in the first episode with them, like they're just programs just executing what they need to get done instead of actually being fully formed human beings. But we get a sense of that, but we don't really. And so I wish the Silver Team had gotten a little bit more to flesh them out, or not flesh them out, and show us that they are these sort of deprogrammed, in control by Halsey humans. But they ultimately are sort of superfluous to this. And then we get some stuff with the Covenant. Again, we have this human who, I guess she is of the same type of human being that John is, that she can probably activate these Forerunner artifacts. And that's all fine. And again, it's clearly she's there just so that the show doesn't constantly have to waste budget on these Covenant creatures. So she's eventually I'm sure gonna confront Master Chief and all that stuff and sort of instigate herself into human society. But I'm curious to see how they develop her character more. Again, I'm more just curious to see how the Covenant has indoctrinated her, and maybe she has the same ideas of control that Halsey has over Master Chief, the Covenant has over her, and sort of like what information is being given to her is sort of limiting her access to understand the totality of the world, and again, going into those same ideas. So again, conceptually, really, really good here. I just need more in terms of the actual characters and story to be able to feel like it's a story worth telling and not just like a philosophy textbook that I'm being handed. But the elements and building blocks are there to be interesting. And then the episode rounds out with John going back to Halsey, and I like this, again, echoing like John just sort of falls back into what's familiar. He doesn't really have access to knowing what the totality of the world is, kind of echoing, again, the same themes of control, and him only saying like Halsey's the only one I can trust, but that's only because Halsey's the only person that he really knows. And so he hasn't really been given a chance to see the greater world. Again, more philosophy, but starting to get at some characterization for John, and I'm at least that I'm appreciating. So ultimately, on the day, like I kind of said, there's elements within here that I'm really enjoying. The world building is great, the themes are great, and the ways that they're displaying these themes within the different dynamics of the groups involved is almost pitch perfect. I just really hope that they can start to back that up with better characterization and better moment-to-moment storytelling. Because both these episodes have felt more like they're laying the groundwork for a good story rather than actually telling me a good story. But I'm intrigued enough, and I'm starting to get past my expectations as a Halo fan to just appreciate the show for what it is. And what's here is intriguing, but not necessarily grabbing me as compelling storytelling yet. But I'd love to hear all your thoughts down in the comments below about the Halo show. Did you like it? Did you dislike it? Are you enjoying it? Are you more on board than I am, or less so? I'd love to hear all that down in the comments below. Also, don't forget that I put up my review of Star Trek Picard Season 2, Episode 5. That is already up, so you can go check that out. I will also be doing reviews of Marvel's Moon Knight, as well as Star Trek Picard going forward, and all Star Trek shows on this channel, as well as some other things I'm hoping to do on this channel in the near future. But beyond all that, thanks so much for watching, and I will see you next time. But until then, I hope you all live long and prosper, my friends.